In September of 1940, in a laneway behind a block of flats in the seaside town of Wollongong, Australia, a man named Vincent Wardle found a sugar bag leaning against a garage wall. Inside the bag was a gun. It was not a gun that any soldier or police officer would have recognised. It had no stock to speak of, just a bent piece of steel. The magazine was a crude drum that could not be removed, only reloaded by hand. The caliber was .22, a round used for shooting rabbits, not fighting wars. It had no safety mechanism. It had no proper trigger guard. It looked like something a teenager had assembled in a shed from scraps of pipe and spare parts. Which is exactly what it was. The gun had been built by Evelyn Owen, a 23-year-old school dropout who had failed at the ready-mix mortar business and had no engineering training of any kind. He had been obsessed with firearms since childhood. Not the theory, not the ballistics, not the metallurgy, but the tinkering. He built his first working automatic mechanism at 16, from scrap metal and spare parts, in a backyard shed in Wollongong that served as his workshop, his laboratory, and his private world. He had no blueprints. He had no reference books. He worked by feel, by trial, by the instinct of a boy who understood how metal moved before he understood why. By 1931, at the age of 16, he had built a crude but functional automatic carbine. By 1938, he had refined it into something he believed the Australian Army would want. He had shown this gun to the Australian Army a year earlier. They told him they were not interested. They told him that Australian forces used British weapons, not backyard inventions. They told him that submachine guns were gangster weapons, not military ones. Owen, defeated and embarrassed, had thrown the gun in a sugar bag, tossed it in a laneway, and enlisted as a private in the army. He was about to ship out to the Middle East. He had given up, but Vincent Wardle had not given up. Wardle managed a steel fabrication plant at Port Kembla, Lissart's Newcastle works, and he understood metal, he understood manufacturing, and when he pulled that ugly little gun out of its sugar bag, he understood something the Australian Army had completely missed. The mechanism was simple, it was robust, and it could be manufactured in quantity by a country that had never built a submachine gun in its history. Wardle showed it to his boss. His boss showed it to Essington Lewis, the Director General of Munitions. Lewis got Owen pulled from his unit before the troopship sailed. The teenager who had been told his gun was worthless was sent back to the factory, and the weapon that would save thousands of Australian lives in the worst jungle fighting of the Second World War began its slow, bitter fight, not against the Japanese but against the Australian military establishment that wanted it dead. What followed was one of the most absurd development processes in weapons history. The original Owen prototype fired .22 caliber ammunition, rabbit rounds, obviously useless for military combat. Wardle and Owen, working with a Swiss-born gunsmith named Fred Kunzler, who had been employed at the Lysite plant, began building new prototypes in military calibers. They built one in 32 ACP. They built another in 45 ACP, because they were assured that plenty of .45 ammunition would be available from stocks imported for the Australian Army's Thompsons. When the ammunition finally arrived at the factory, it turned out to be .455 Webley revolver ammunition. Wrong cartridge, wrong weapon, completely incompatible. So they went back again and rebuilt the gun using a section of barrel cut from an old Martini Henry rifle, a weapon from the 1880s, a submachine gun designed in 1938, firing through a barrel from the Victorian era, chambered in a caliber nobody had asked for. The whole project lurched from one improvisation to the next, driven by a team that had never designed a military weapon, working in a steelworks that had never manufactured one, using whatever materials happened to be available that week. And somehow, out of this chaos, they produced a gun that worked. The final production version was chambered in 9mm parabellum, the same round used by the Sten, the MP40, and half the armies in the world. This was a practical decision. 9mm ammunition was available in enormous quantities because the Allies were already manufacturing it for other weapons. A soldier carrying an Owen gun could scavenge ammunition from captured Japanese stocks of 9mm, from Allied supply dumps, from the pouches of dead enemies. Logistics won wars, and the 9mm decision meant the Owen gun would never be short of ammunition. To understand why Australia needed the Owen gun, you have to understand the catastrophe that was unfolding across the Pacific in early 1942. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, fell in February. Over 80,000 Allied soldiers became prisoners of war in the largest British surrender in history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Burma was overrun. The Japanese were advancing south at a speed that made the German blitzkrieg look cautious. Darwin was bombed. Sydney Harbour was penetrated by midget submarines. For the first time in its history, Australia faced the genuine possibility of invasion, and the Australian Army, spread across North Africa, the Middle East and the Pacific, did not have a submachine gun of its own. It relied entirely on British Stens and American Thompsons, and both were in desperately short supply because Britain and America needed them for their own armies. The Thompson was heavy, nearly 11 pounds loaded. It was expensive, over $200 per unit, at a time when a factory worker earned $40 a month. It jammed in sand, it jammed in mud, it jammed in the tropical humidity that turned every metal surface in the Pacific into a sheet of rust within days. The Sten, Britain's emergency substitute, was lighter and cheaper, but it had a reputation for accidental discharges that terrified the men who carried it. A Sten dropped on hard ground could fire by itself. A Sten with a loaded magazine could go off if the bolt snagged on clothing. Soldiers in Europe called it the plumber's nightmare. Australian soldiers who tested it called it something worse, and neither weapon, the Thompson nor the Sten, had been designed for the one environment where Australian soldiers would do most of their fighting and dying: the jungle. New Guinea was not a battlefield in any conventional sense. It was a green hell. The Kokoda Track, the narrow trail over the Owen Stanley Range that connected the northern coast to Port Moresby, climbed through terrain so steep that soldiers had to pull themselves up cliff faces by gripping tree roots and vines. The humidity sat above 90%. Rain fell in sheets that turned the track into a river of mud so deep that men sank to their thighs. Temperatures swung from suffocating heat in the lowlands to freezing cold above the cloud line. Malaria killed more men than bullets. Dysentery turned combat soldiers into skeletal wrecks who could barely stand, let alone fight. And the Japanese soldiers they faced, veterans of China, trained in jungle warfare, masters of camouflage and night infiltration, were among the most formidable light infantry in the world. They climbed trees with hooks strapped to their boots. They hid motionless for hours, waiting for a single shot. They attacked at night in waves, throwing grenades and screaming to break the defender's nerve. In this environment, a soldier's weapon was not just his tool, it was his life, and every weapon the Australians carried into that jungle was failing. The Thompson was too heavy to carry through mud that sucked at every step. Its weight, combined with the weight of ammunition, water, rations and equipment, was crushing men who were already weakened by disease and starvation. The Sten was lighter, but its side-mounted magazine caught on vines and branches with every step through dense undergrowth, and both weapons jammed, constantly. Mud worked into the mechanisms, water corroded the internal parts, humidity swelled wooden stocks and rusted springs. A soldier whose weapon jammed in a firefight at 20 meters against a Japanese soldier with a bayonet was a dead man, and Australian soldiers were dying because their weapons could not handle the one thing the jungle never stopped producing: mud. The Owen gun solved this problem with a piece of engineering so simple that it is almost embarrassing to describe. The magazine fed from the top. Every other submachine gun in the world, the Thompson, the Sten, the MP40, the Pipich-41, fed ammunition from the side or from below. This meant the magazine spring had to push cartridges upward or sideways against gravity. In clean, dry conditions, this worked perfectly well. In mud, it did not. A side-mounted magazine on a Steen could be clogged by a single clump of wet earth pushed into the feed lips. A bottom-mounted magazine on a Thompson required the spring to fight gravity, while simultaneously fighting the friction of mud-coated cartridges. The Owen gun's top-mounted magazine used gravity as an ally. Cartridges were pushed downward, down toward the breech, down toward the chamber, down with the assistance of the same force that pulled rain from the sky. Mud could not accumulate on top of the cartridges because the cartridges were already at the bottom. Water drained downward through the ejection port, which opened on the underside of the receiver. Foreign matter fell out rather than building up. The gun cleaned itself. The internal design was equally deliberate. The Owen gun used a simple blowback mechanism. The bolt was driven backward by the force of the fired cartridge, compressing a return spring, which then pushed the bolt forward again to chamber the next round. Nothing complicated about that. Every cheap submachine gun in the world used blowback, but Grabin, or rather Owen and Wardle, and a Swiss-born gunsmith named Fred Kunzler, who worked at the Lysaght plant, added one feature that no other submachine gun possessed. A small steel bulkhead inside the receiver separated the bolt from the cocking handle. This wall created two sealed compartments, the firing mechanism in front, the cocking mechanism behind. If mud or debris entered through the cocking handle slot, the one opening that every blowback gun needed, and every blowback gun was vulnerable through, it stayed behind the bulkhead. It never reached the bolt. It never reached the chamber. It never caused a jam. Think of it as a firewall inside a computer. Contamination on one side cannot cross to the other. The same principle applied to a steel tube in 1941. The barrel was designed to be changed quickly in the field, a feature that mattered during sustained jungle firefights, where a patrol might empty dozens of magazines in minutes. The gun fired at roughly 700 rounds per minute, fast enough to shred foliage and the men hiding behind it. Its effective range was around 200 meters, which in jungle fighting was roughly 10 times the distance at which most engagements actually occurred. The weight was just under 10 pounds loaded, a full pound lighter than the Thompson, and the entire weapon could be manufactured using stamped metal, simple machining, and components that a steelworks already had the tooling to produce. It cost roughly $30 per unit. The Thompson cost over 200. In September of 1941, the Australian Army held a comparative trial. The Owen gun was tested against the Thompson, the Sten, and the German Bergmann. The guns were fired dry, then they were submerged in water, then buried in mud, then packed with sand. After each test, they were fired again without cleaning. The Thompson jammed, the Sten jammed, the Bergmann jammed. The Owen gun fired every round, every time through every test. When the evaluators pulled it from a trench of muddy water, shook it off and pulled the trigger, it emptied its magazine without a single failure. Those present at the trial agreed. The Owen was the simplest, cheapest and toughest submachine gun they had ever tested, and still the Army hesitated. The Master General of the Ordnance, Major General Edward Milford, told Owen that the Army was prepared to wait for deliveries of the British Sten. Australia did not need its own submachine gun, he said. Britain would supply one. It took a direct intervention by the Minister for the Army, Percy Spender, overruling his own military advisers, to place an initial order of 100 Owen guns. That order, born of political will, not military enthusiasm, saved the programme. Without Spender, the Owen gun would have died in a factory stockroom, and Australian soldiers would have gone into the jungle with Stens that jammed, and Thompsons they could barely carry. By late 1942, the first Owen guns reached frontline Australian units fighting the Japanese in New Guinea. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers who had been cursing their Stens and struggling under the weight of their Thompsons took one patrol with the Owen gun and refused to give it back. They called it the Digger's Delight. They called it the only weapon in the army that worked when everything else was trying to kill them. The mud, the rain, the humidity, the rot, the rust, and the Japanese. An Australian variant of the Sten, the Austin, was also developed and tested alongside the Owen. Soldiers rejected it outright. They wanted the Owen. Only the Owen. At the Battle of Bunagona in late 1942 and early 1943, one of the bloodiest engagements in the Pacific War, Australian soldiers fighting through coastal swamps used Owen guns to clear Japanese bunker complexes that had resisted everything else. The Japanese had built their defences using coconut logs reinforced with earth, virtually invisible from the air, and impervious to anything short of direct artillery fire. Australian infantry had to crawl through swamp water up to their chests, cross open ground under machine gun fire, and fight at point-blank range into bunker apertures. A weapon that jammed in swamp water was a death sentence. The Owen gun fired through it. Soldiers reported crawling through chest-deep water, with the Owen held above their heads, then rolling into a firing position and emptying a magazine into a bunker slit at 3 meters without the gun missing a beat. The water drained out, the mechanism cycled. The Japanese inside the bunker died. That was the Owen gun's combat debut, in conditions that no weapons designer in any country had ever imagined a submachine gun would face. At the Battle for Lae and Salamaua in 1943, Owen guns were carried by the 9th Division soldiers who made the amphibious landing east of Lae, wading through surf, crossing rivers, fighting through kunai grass taller than a man. Scouts moving ahead of the main body carried Owens because the weapon's compact firepower could break a Japanese ambush in the 2 seconds it took a patrol to react or die. Every moment of hesitation, every fraction of a second spent clearing a jam, working a bolt or struggling with a feed failure, was a moment the Japanese used to kill you. The Owen gun eliminated that hesitation. Let me put you on the Kokoda track in November of 1942. You are a scout in the 2nd 33rd Battalion, moving north through jungle so dense that you cannot see the man 5 meters behind you. The track is knee-deep in mud. It has been raining for 6 days without stopping. Your uniform is rotting on your body. You have not eaten a full meal in a week. You carry your Owen gun across your chest, the top-mounted magazine jutting upward like a periscope, catching on every vine and branch, and you do not care, because you have fired this gun caked in mud that would have killed a Thompson, and it has not failed you once. Ahead, through the green murk, you hear movement. You drop to one knee. The Japanese patrol emerges from behind a curtain of ferns at 15 meters, close enough to see the sweat on the lead soldier's face. You fire. The Owen barks. Short, sharp. The cyclic rate shredding the silence. 700 rounds per minute. The magazine empties in 4 seconds. The lead soldier drops. The man behind him drops. The rest scatter into the undergrowth. You pull the empty magazine, it slides straight up, no twisting, no fumbling, and push a fresh one down into the receiver. It locks with a click. You're firing again in under 3 seconds. The Japanese do not return. American soldiers who encountered the Owen gun in the field were stunned by its reliability. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, was so impressed that he proposed contracting 45,000 Owen guns for his own American troops. The proposal was rejected by Washington, which insisted that American forces use American weapons. But the fact that MacArthur asked that the Supreme Commander of the largest military force in the Pacific wanted to replace his Thompsons with a gun designed by a school dropout from Wollongong tells you everything about what the Owen gun was. By the end of the war, over 45,000 Owen guns had been produced. They fought at Buna and Gona, at Lae and Salamaua, at Borneo and Balikpapan. They fought in every major Australian action in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. They were carried by infantry scouts, by commandos, by coast watchers operating behind Japanese lines, and they earned a reputation that no other Australian weapon has matched before or since. The gun that never jammed, never failed, never let a digger down when the jungle was trying to kill him and the Japanese were 5 meters away. The German equivalent in the MP-40 was a superb weapon in the European theatre, reliable, compact, well manufactured, but the MP-40's side-mounted magazine and open-bolt design were not built for jungle conditions. The MP-40 worked in the cold of Russia and the dust of North Africa because those environments, harsh as they were, did not produce the kind of saturating, penetrating, all-consuming moisture that the Pacific jungle did. Water and mud were the Owen gun's environment. No other submachine gun in any army on any front was designed to thrive in them. The Japanese Type 100 submachine gun, the only submachine gun Japan ever mass-produced, was rare, poorly distributed, and considered a secondary weapon by an army that prized the bolt-action Arisaka rifle and the bayonet above all else. Japanese infantry doctrine centered on disciplined rifle fire and close-quarters bayonet charges, not automatic weapons. This gave Australian soldiers with Owen guns a devastating advantage in the close-range jungle firefights that defined the New Guinea campaign. A Japanese soldier working a bolt-action rifle could fire 8 to 10 named rounds per minute. An Australian with an Owen gun could put 200 rounds downrange in the same time. At the distances that mattered in the jungle, 5 to 20 meters, volume of fire was everything. The Owen gun turned Australian scouts and forward patrols into mobile walls of lead that the Japanese simply could not match. The Stein, the weapon the Australian army had been prepared to wait for, served adequately in Europe. Over 4 million were built, but the Sten's reputation among the soldiers who used it was never better than grudging acceptance. Commandos carried it because it was cheap and silent with a suppressor, but they did not love it. They tolerated it. Australian soldiers loved the Owen gun. That distinction between a weapon you tolerate and a weapon you trust with your life is the difference the Owens engineering made. After the war, the Owen gun did not retire. It went to Korea. At the Battle of Kapyong in April of 1951, one of the most desperate defensive actions of the Korean War, soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, used Owen guns to cut down waves of Chinese infantry, attacking their positions in the hills above the Kapyong River Valley. The Chinese came at night in massed formations, pressing through the valley against Australian and Canadian positions that were the last line of defence before Seoul. Major Ben O'Dowd later recalled that the diggers directed everything they had into the first surge of attackers, and the rapid fire of Owen guns was the sound that dominated the ridge. The battalion was surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. They called in an airstrike on their own position. They held. The 3rd Battalion received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the highest American unit award given to a foreign force, for their stand at Kapyong, and the Owen gun, by then nearly a decade old, designed by a dead man in a town most Americans had never heard of, performed exactly as it had in the jungles of New Guinea. Mud, cold, snow, it did not matter. It fired. Australian scouts carried Owen guns through the rubber plantations of the Malayan Emergency in the 1950s, hunting communist guerrillas in terrain that was, once again, dense, wet, and hostile to every other weapon in the inventory. In Rhodesia, Owen guns turned up in the hands of bush war combatants during the 1960s and 70s, weapons that had travelled from Australian factories to Pacific battlefields to African conflicts, their journey spanning 3 decades and 4 continents. In the early years of the Vietnam War, Australian soldiers carried Owen guns on patrols in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province, scouts in infantry sections, the men who walked point, the men who made first contact with the enemy, the men who lived or died based on whether their weapon fired in the first half-second of an ambush, chose the Owen gun over every alternative in the inventory. The gun that had been built in 1941 was still in frontline service in 1966, 25 years after Evelyn Owen pulled it out of a sugar bag. It was finally replaced by the F1 submachine gun in 1971, but the F1's design borrowed the Owen's offset sights and jungle-optimized features. Even the weapon that replaced it could not escape the Owen's shadow. Evelyn Owen never saw any of it. After the war ended, he received £10,000 in royalties and patent payments from the Commonwealth of Australia. He used the money to buy a sawmill near Wollongong. He lived alone. He continued to tinker with firearms, sport rifles mostly, but nothing came of his post-war designs. Returning soldiers sought him out in pubs across Wollongong to buy him a beer, because as they saw it, his invention had saved their lives. Owen accepted the beers. He accepted many beers. Alcohol consumed him the way the jungle had consumed his gun, completely and without mercy. On the 1st of April 1949, Evelyn Ernest Owen was admitted to Wollongong Hospital with a ruptured gastric ulcer caused by chronic alcoholism. He died that same day. He was 33 years old. He never learned that his gun would fight in Korea. He never knew about Kapyong. He never knew about Malaya or Vietnam. The man who built the weapon that never failed died believing that the best years of his life and his invention were already behind him. Today, Owen guns sit in glass cases at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, in military museums across the Pacific, in private collections where veterans' grandchildren keep them oiled and clean. In 2004, an underground weapons factory was raided in Melbourne, and among the weapons seized were 3 suppressed copies of the Owen gun, hand-built by criminals who recognised 60 years later that the fundamental design was still worth copying. A gun built by a school dropout in a backyard shed in Wollongong. A gun the Australian Army rejected because it preferred to wait for British imports. A gun that was rescued from a sugar bag by a neighbour who happened to work at a steel plant. 45,000 built, 29 years of service, 4 wars, every jungle on Earth, and it started with a teenager who was told to go home because Australian soldiers did not use Australian weapons. They told him no. A neighbour found it in a sugar bag, and the diggers called it the only gun in the Pacific that never let them down.